Welcome to me and Dwight's presentation. Welcome to me and Dwight's presentation about the Dene and Azkaban people, and we appreciate your time, willing to listen and learn more about this group of people. Now, I know that as I've come to learn more and understand them, especially from the geological side of things, it's really expanded my knowledge and also my appreciation for the many things that they've been able to pass down, and we've actually been able to learn from these people.
So the Dene and the Dene people have been around for about the past 30,000 years. And they've been in the Northwest Territories in the northwest part of Canada for a long time. Um, but there has not been much cultural advancements until when the Vikings came and taught them how to smelt ores, and that happened about 2,000 years ago.
Our next part is about the celestial influences. With the Dene people, celestial bodies had a lot of importance to them. Their main two is the Traveler, which is a set of stars that they used for guidance, while also the Big Dipper. These they would use for traveling, but also predictions. A cool part of the Dene culture is for learning. They wouldn't use the normal methods that we generally think of, but instead their focus was on observation and not instruction. So they expected children to be able to learn from this method. And as part of that, the women in the household, and especially the lead um, woman in the house, was actually in charge of predictions and of telling what was going to happen with the weather. And so they'd be able to tell based on the things that they had seen and also from what they learned from observing their mothers, and they'd be able to tell the weather. But also with the Big Dipper, depending on which side the handle of the dipper was facing, would also be able to tell them um, how fortunate their luck would be for future endeavors.
And so, as for the location of the Dene people, they were mainly located in northwest Canada, as we can see up here up by Slave Lake, and um, they inhabited a lot of this area, and they had a lot of cultural influence in this area. But there was also other little regions where their language was found, including Southwest America and this more warmer part. So obviously, it was different tribes and stuff.
For the Dene people, maps weren't the way we think of maps is often a drawn or written down map. For the Dene people, this wasn't the case. Instead, they actually would pass down the different orientations of where they're going on their trails and their areas where they're going to be traveling through oral recitation. Recitation. And so they actually didn't come up with a word for maps until years after the Europeans came over. And so this is actually a picture, if you see on the slide, of a collection of hunting trails and traveling trails that they were able to map out years later, now in this century, to be able to show what their oral traditions kind of showed where those trails are and what their maps look like for an actual um, viewpoint as we have come to know what maps are.
So as for the tectonic plate boundaries, the Dene people live directly on top of the North American plate, and there are other faults that are pretty close. The Queen Charlotte Fault, which is a slip strike fault, just like the San Andreas Fault, um, which causes a lot of earthquakes. And so the Dene people have undoubtedly had earthquakes during their time while living in this on this North America plate. And
So, due to the type of area that this was, especially with the Yukon block being so active, with the constant shifting between the Pacific and the North American plates, um, there are a lot of minerals and different type of rock types. So you get a lot of igneous rock from different volcanoes. One main one that happened that really affected the people there of the Deneen was Mount Churchill, which is one of the tallest. I think it's one of the fifth or seventh tallest in the United States or in the North America. And this one, when it exploded, um, covered ash up to almost 2 feet thick in some areas. They're able to see. Um, there's also large amounts of sedimentary. There's even some layers of sedimentary rock from the Jurassic period. So, as well as there are metamorphic rocks that are brought from the Yukon block moving constantly, like we talked about before. So, in this area, there's many different types of rock types and minerals as well. A big one was copper. Not so much with iron, as they weren't able to learn how to use that until later on, when the Vikings came over from Greenland. So, so with all that,
Let's go back. So as I talked about in my previous slide, there's a lot of earthquakes in this area. Thank goodness that not a lot of them are major. I mean, as we can see over here on the Queen Charlotte, there is quite a few major ones, right? And that would undoubtedly send waves, and I'm guessing sometimes tsunamis to the Deneen people. But what they dealt with were low to moderate earthquakes. And even though there's a lot of them, I'm grateful that they were still just low to moderate. But as for recorded history, the Deneen people have an oral history, so there's not much recorded. But what they had a lot of nomadic lifestyles, and so I'm guessing that earthquakes didn't really affect them that much, did not put their lives in danger.
so with all that volcanic activity and the plate changes, you get a lot of mountain ranges. There's 5 main ones. The pictures we have showing here, one is the top left one is the Mackenzie Mountain Range. The one on the right is the Brooks Range, and the one on the bottom is the Caribou Range. Um, but most of these consist of shale and limestone, um, with also some metamorphic rock types as well. And there's also large amounts of granite, as there's massive amounts of volcanic activity as well, especially in the higher areas. Some of the cool places with the Caribou Mountains is that there's a high amount of quartz, and then with the Selwyn Mountains, a lot of quartz and mica was also found there for minerals. Most of the copper that they found or used um, was from the Mackenzie Mountain Range, and that was mostly um, down in the river areas as it would wash off down on through to the rivers. So,
Um, and as for weathering and erosion in this area, it affected the Deneen people, because there were landslides, and quite a lot of them. And this is because in this region there's a lot of heavy rains and there's a lot of heavy snowfalls. And when these snowfalls melt, it does create sometimes flash flooding and erosions, as we can see here in this forest. It looks as if there was a lot of erosion. I mean, there's a landslide right here, and there actually is oral history of landslides affecting the Deneen people.
so one of my favorite areas is the Okanagan Desert. This is in British Columbia. I'm from Alberta, so this is just the next province over. This is actually a high desert area, um, just kind of like here in Utah or in Provo and Salt Lake area, high desert. So you have large mountain ranges while pretty dry like shrublands in the bottom. This area is known for large amounts of variety of animals. That includes antelope, black bears, bighorn sheep, as well as some of the cool ones are there's multiple owl species that live up there, including burrowing owls as well. There's also a lot of plant life that is not seen anywhere else. Only where closest is in Alberta, but those kind of desert areas don't have the same type of sagebrush or anything like that. But this Okanagan Desert is also an area um, where there's a lot of vineyards and a lot of areas that do well in the drier climate with not as severe of winters. But it still does get fairly cold in the winters.
Um, and then as for glaciers, so there's a lot of glaciers in this area as well. Having the polar and tundra biomes means that there will be glaciers, and especially in the very northern part, there's glaciers, and these glaciers are constantly melting and refreezing. And so the Deneen people have undoubtedly dealt with glaciers, and there is one recorded story of how there was this mountain moving, and this is definitely a glacier that was in the act of melting and sliding. And so, as we can see here, these glaciers are melting and turning into this water and flowing downstream.
So with the rivers and deltas, um, one of the main ones that affected the Indian people was the Mackenzie River. So this is kind of the base of the Mackenzie Mountains, and it actually it's where it originally starts is Great Slave Lake, which is a massive lake kind of on the border of Alberta and Northwest Territories in Canada. And there's a river that connects that called the Great Bear River, going into the Mackenzie River. And the Mackenzie River actually travels northwest, which is kind of cool because the only other river I know of that does that is the Nile. But it travels northwest up into the Arctic Ocean and into the delta up there. Um, this waterway and river is a huge source for fish and plant life, um, as you have the different type of waters kind of mixing because there you have the waters coming in from the mountains and then also the water coming in from Great Slave Lake, like I was talking about, has a different type of mineral content, and it's actually a really cool area. The Delta was a huge area for where the Dene people stayed for long periods of time, mainly because of how rich in mineral content. So you'd have a lot of plant life, as well as it was a great place for fish, as the fish, especially the salmon, would come from the Arctic down the waterways and actually helped build up the forest due to their habits, as well as the beluga whales. Their main breeding grounds is actually in the Mackenzie River Delta. And so the Dene people lived off the fish and the beluga whales, as well as the other birds. Migratory birds actually use this waterway as kind of a guidance. Because if it goes so far, they're able to travel along that and have places to rest, as well as easy places to travel and nutrition food sources all along the way. So that is why the Mackenzie River is one of the major ones for the Dene people and has affected them.
And talking a little bit about what Nathan was talking about with the rivers, um, the trade routes, or the ways in which they were able to trade with neighboring tribes and such, is through one of the main rivers. They talked about the Mackenzie River. So this was a major trade route for the Dene people to travel up and down and trade in between the indigenous tribes there. And so this river was very easily maneuverable, and it allowed, and we can see it right here, it flows into the Arctic and down to the Slave Lake. This was very easy for them to maneuver with their furs and pelts for trades and stuff. And there was not much trade with colonizers and stuff, and so it was mainly all in between the indigenous people up there.
So one thing that's cool with the Dene people is they were more of an isolated group. Um, wasn't There wasn't very much influence from the outside world, except for other tribes with different dialects. There is some confusion though, as there is Asian weaponry that moved over in the form of copper knives and different things like that. But with oceans and shipping routes, there's no noticeable sources on whether they did trade or not, but they stuck around close to the oceans, especially in the Puget Sound and the San Juan Islands. Um, they stayed in these areas because they could use canoes, and be able to travel from one area to another. Um, and as with the picture on the left, they're actually a picture from an event. They still travel in canoes and do um, a race that they used to do for hundreds of years. Um, they also, as we talked about in the river section, they used the deltas from the Arctic, and this kind of gives you an idea of how big of the span the Dene people lived in, as they covered most of um, Alaska, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and even down into BC and kind of the top of Washington.
And so as for the types of coastlines that the Dene people had, they were backed right up to the Pacific Ocean. And up in this northern part, it was a lot of rocky and sandy coastlines. And so pretty uninhabitable in a sense of um, growing food and stuff, but that's not which meant they did. But it did allow for multiple types of wildlife to inhabit it. And that is what they used the coastline for. They didn't have much going on at the coastline. They mainly stayed inland around the rivers and other parts. But that is the coastline that's right next to them.
On the topic of atmospheric circulation and precipitation patterns, the two major winds that they would face or come into contact with often was the polar easterlies, which would come from the northeast and bring the cold down from the polar caps or the Arctic, and then also the westerlies that would also bring the cold air, but this is from the west. And both would bring in cold air in. One thing that's cool though is you'd also have a change in air temperature due to atmospheric circulations from the oceans. And what I mean by that is you'd get warmer air coming off the ocean. That was a very humid air. And then as it climbed up and over the mountains, it would start to slow down and reduce as much precipitation as it had. And actually, as it goes up and over the mountain, kind of like we talked about with the rain effect, is it would actually kind of warm up. And that's what's known as the Chinook wind. And especially where I live, which is similar to the areas where they inhabited, um, we get those constantly all throughout the winter and through the summer, though they're not as noticeable. It'll actually clear the snow from the area for a day or two until that air mass leaves and either the westerlies or the polar easterlies come back in.
And so a little bit about the severe weather. So this area receives a lot of rain and snow, a lot of heavy rain and snow, and um, it's a very cold and bitter climate. And so there's a lot of blizzards and stuff. And there is record stories of these white blizzards coming through and just drowning everything in snow. And it is very cold and bitter through a lot of the year. And the Dene people were very strong and resilient to be able to fight through this cold and have thriving families.
So as we talked about before, especially with the desert region and the affected glaciers, there's really two different climates that they interacted with. One was the CFB, which is a temperate climate with warm summers and high humidities. And the other classification is the DFC, which is a polar climate with cold and humid winters, so a lot of snowfall. Um, but due to climate change and a lot of effects that have happened over the past 100 years or more, we're actually seeing a lot of dangerous effects to the native populations and to the Dene people that are still around. We see that often with the Arctic as the ice caps are slowly melting, which is reducing the amount of surface area for seals, which was a mainstay for them because they like to rest on top of the glaciers to kind of avoid the orcas, as well as it reduces the amount of area for polar bears, as polar bears generally swim from one floating ice chunk to the next. Now, as those gradually go grow smaller, they're having to find newer areas to live. And so this has actually affected a lot of the Dene people. In a recent article I was reading, they've actually been affected on their hunting trails, where they used to be able to drive on either their snowmobiles or on their dog sleds year round. And now it's actually become muddy, and they aren't able to go into the same areas or travel as they used to, which has greatly affected them.
And so as for the biomes in the Deneen area, there are three main biome types, including the taiga, the polar, and the tundra. And so at the very top picture, we have a picture of the polar. It includes a lot of snow, a lot of glaciers, pretty desolate, pretty uninhabitable. The middle is the taiga, and it has cold temperatures and coniferous forests. And so these coniferous forests were very good for the Deneen people. The Dene people were able to hunt, trap, grow, do all the things that they needed to do inside of these forests. It allows them to have tons of resources around them and it really sustain their life there. And the tundra is the very bottom picture, and it's very desert-like, and plants are minimal. And where there are plants, they're pretty waxy and stuff. So the Deneen people were able to survive very well inside of the taiga forests and use it to their best advantage.
So as we've talked about, the area where the Dene people lived is one that has many vital resources, and has plentiful game. And so that's originally what brought people from other countries, especially European influences, in. Um, as there was is first started with trapping, especially with the East India Trading Company, which is separated into the Hudson Bay Company, which also funded the Northwest Trading Company. All these two major ones, the Hudson Bay and the Northwest Trading Companies, both affected the Dene people as they started taking their land and pushing them off. And especially recently, they're finding that natives or First Nations people, like the Dene people, were their children were taken and put into schools, and there's a lot of serious issues as there was mass graves and different things like that. So a lot of terrible things that happened, and a lot of this was due to the natural resources that are in the area, especially as in 1920, oil was found up by the Mackenzie River Delta. And since that was a huge area for Dene people, they were all pushed out, which was really sad and unfortunate. But those are some of the major features for the Dene people, especially the area where they lived.
And the Deneen people were famously known for being very stewardly. They cared about the land in which they lived, and they felt a spiritual connection to it. And so since they felt that spiritual connection to it, they wanted to treat it very well and make sure that it was preserved and would stay for a long time. And so the Deneen people were very good about taking care of where they lived. And there's a story of how they felt really connected to mountains, and they found that it was very sacred and spiritual places. And so their stewardship was utmost, probably one of the highest in all of the groups from these presentations. And they were very respectful to the way in which they treated the land, and they cared about preserving it.
So with that, that's the end of our presentation. We hope you were able to take some things and learn some from what we told you. And one thing that I've learned is how fascinating these people were, and still are today. They have many great oral traditions that are slowly being revived, and also being recorded now that we can take videos. And they have remarkably different climates, and different aspects of their culture that each need to be learned and remembered. I challenge each of you to be able to look into these people and do your own research and try to learn some more, because as we slowly learn about everyone, we can come together as people and be able to really come from a place of understanding for cultures and everyone that's around us. Thank you and have a great day.